Hey, you okay? Okay. Good morning. Thank you. So yesterday, we set up our Visual Studio project. I explained that what we're creating is a web application, and that web application is just sitting there on the server waiting for an input. And a HTTP request is sent to your server. That request we can think of like a text file. It's just a bunch of information. It's got a path. And that gets passed along a pipeline that we call the middleware pipeline. And each section has a look at the input, checks to see if it can do anything with it, and once it can, it gets returned to the user as a response. But if it can't do anything, it's passed to the next one in the chain. And then yesterday, the last thing we did was we installed the MVC middleware. Well, we installed the package, and then we added the MVC middleware in our configure method of the startup file. And what we'll be doing today is we're going to be we've got the MVC middleware there, but it's not going to do anything just yet. We need to actually set up some stuff ourselves. And because this room doesn't have, oh, there's a whiteboard. Okay, there's a whiteboard right there. Didn't have whiteboards until just now on the back of this envelope. So we've got our model view controller pattern, which we talked about before, and that's where the MVC comes from. And so we have our model, remember, is our data. So that for us in ASP.NET, that's going to be a C# class that's going to represent the data we care about. In this example, we're going to be doing like the classic example you see every web app does, is a list of contacts. So our model will be some contacts. Our controller is going to be a set of C# methods. We're going to call them controller actions. And the first thing, we'll have a request will come in and it'll go into our routing system. If you look, we've set up our MVC middleware has the default route. What that means is that the path at the end of our URL, the routing system, our R here, is going to look at that and it's going to say, right, where does this need to go? And it's going to decide what controller to instantiate and create. And then the controller, it might need to grab a model and get something back. And then it's going to go to the view. It's going to decide what view the user needs to see. It's going to render that view, where it's going to create some HTML and send that back to the user. And that's kind of the gist of that horrible diagram that you can't quite see. Okay, so I'm going to put HTML on the right and turn this thing off. So I've started streaming and it is in the Slack if you want to see it on your laptop or whatever, but I think the screens are pretty decent in this room. So let's continue with our coding. The general aim is by the end of this process, we're going to have a application, quite a basic application that that we can add some things to a database and render them on the screen. So we've set up a middleware, but we need to actually set up some folders. The framework is considered something that's called convention over configuration. So we don't go in and start tweaking things ourselves. There aren't lots of setup files for us to do stuff with. If we follow the conventions that we're meant to follow, things will just magically work. So the first thing I need to do is create some folders. So I right click and do, where is it? How do you do it? Add, there we go. So there's an add there, new folder, and we need a models folder. And the models folder is going to keep all of our C# classes that are on models. I'm going to make another folder called views. The views folder is going to have all our Razor in it, which is where our views come from. And then finally, I'm going to add a controllers folder. Okay, now remember, this is just it's a directory view. So this is our kind of upper directory, and if we create things on this level, it will create things in the kind of parent directory, and that can be important sometimes. So the first thing, the way I tend to do things is think about it like with a controller first. So we're going to create a controller, then we're going to look at the views and everything else. So I'm going to right click again, go to add, and then controller. Now here, you get a choice here now. When you get to know the framework better, you'll be able to use some of these other options here. In particular, this one, so that allows you to create an MVC controller with views using the entity framework. And what that is actually going to do for you is it's not just going to create your controller, it's going to create all your views, and it's even going to set a database up for you. But for now, I want to show you the nuts and bolts. So I'm going to create an empty one and click add. And I'm going to call it the home controller because I'll explain why that in a second. So the convention here is that controllers are named, our controller name, controller, and that's a C# file. So what this is doing is it's scaffolding that controller. Something to keep bearing in mind is that when you do, you definitely want to go through this whole process that I'm going through in these lectures. So the PDF is on Blackboard. But when you're doing your actual final project, you probably won't do it this way. You'll use scaffolding more. Okay, so here we go. We have our controller, which is our home controller here. Now this is a C# class. And if you remember from the C# lecture, this little colon means we're inheriting a base class, and we're inheriting the controller base class, which is going to give us all the functions and methods and parameters we need, properties we need for this to be working as a controller. At the moment, there is just one method in here, the index method. It's returning an object that implements the iActionResult interface. So it could be any number of classes, but it has to implement this particular interface. And that's key because we can return some HTML, we could return a JSON file, some XML, a PDF. We don't have to return the same thing to a browser. So in C#, all it's saying is, as long as what the thing you're returning implements this iActionResult interface, then it'll work. It's fine. So if I run this now, I'll see how long this takes to run. If it takes too much to run, I won't keep running it each time. You can see that what it's doing is returning a view. And that's actually a method. So we'll see how this goes. So I push this one side. That view method, if you look, is kind of quite small, but that's actually coming from this controller base class. So we're returning view, and it says creates a view result object that renders a view to the response. And I'm going to tell you, because this is taking too long, that what would happen is when I run that, I would get an error. And I would get an error because it would say there isn't a view. Because all we've done is create the controller. But we also now need to create the view. And there's a really easy way to do that, is I can click here. So I've left click on that line. I'm going to right click. And you can see it says add view. I'm going to left click on that. And then it's given me a bunch of different... I can name this view. I'm going to leave it as the default that's set there. Template, I'm making it empty. What's quite nice is with the scaffolding, once I've got models, I can actually type in here a C# class I want this view to display, and it will do some extra stuff for me. For now, I'm just going to click OK and add it. And what it's going to do, it's going to look at our routing system. So remember, we have, when you get a request on your web application, the path goes to a routing system, and the routing system decides what C# method to call. Now, when I right-clicked that and clicked Add View, it went to the routing system in reverse. So it said, right, we're going to create a view that has the right name and is in the right folders for this particular method. And what it's done is it's created in views, it's created a home folder and an index HTML, CS HTML, because it's Razor. Remember, Razor is a scripting language that is kind of a mixture of HTML and C#. So this is what it's created. But the key thing to understand here is the convention that it followed. Is that we have our home controller. So our home controller is a C# class that inherits the controller class. We've got a method there, index, and we can have all sorts of interesting things going on this method. It returns a view, but the default view for this method is in home. So we've got in our views folder, home because it's the home controller, and then index because it's the index method. And that's the convention. So we've got a view for this method. So, again, this might take too long. I'll see how this goes. I think it's partly because I'm streaming as well. And this laptop's pretty good, but it's still going to struggle. It might get quicker when we've got things going on in there. So I can show you actually what's going to happen. So this is our index, and this is the first time you've seen Razor. So Razor is a mixture between C# and HTML. And what you'll see a lot of is this @ symbol. So the @ symbol is telling this scripting language, I'm going to write some C#. So you can see here, okay, it's done. So we've got this index header here. All that it's rendered is this line, which is normal HTML. This bit in here is C#. And it's not like there's nothing that's been rendered to the browser there. There's nothing that's been actually given to the browser. This is our code. Think about it when I showed you the PHP, that we had the PHP code that wasn't sent to the browser. So we can do stuff there we know the user's not going to see. Now, I can also... Notice there's no path here, but I can also type in home. I go to the same place, And I can also type in home index. And this is showing you kind of your first taste of that routing system. So what's happening, this request is going to the server, and the server is looking at this path, home index. And it's saying, right, home, the first one there, that's the controller name. And then the last one is the action within that controller. So here it's saying, go to the home controller and call the index action. Now, what's quite nice is because we use the default routing, there are like some defaults. So if I get rid of index, I haven't got a, like I've only got one directory, I guess, written there, but it's not really a directory because remember, this isn't a file-based system. If you don't have one there, then it's going to do the default, and the default is index. And it's kind of something that's been, the idea of index.html being your default page is something we've always, you know, that's the way the internet has always worked. So it's in this framework. I also don't need to put home because again, if there is no path, the default routing is to just return the home controller. Is to go to the home controller and do whatever that is. I can't type in index here. If I do that, I'm going to get, I get a hello world actually, because what's happened is, I'll close this now, is that in our startup, we've still got this. So what happens when I typed index there, it looked for an index controller. The MVC middleware looked for an index controller, and there wasn't one. So there was nothing for that middleware to do. So it just passed the request onto the next middleware, which happened to be this hello world function. So I'm actually going to remove that so we can see if there's some errors. The last thing we want is every time our application fails, the user just getting a hello world message. Now we can change that routing because a website's URL is kind of like its user interface. And at the moment, if we just leave things the way they are, your class structure might not be a nice way to interact with a website. So you might want to override that default routing. And there's lots of ways, you know, I'll leave it to you to kind of, we might talk about it a bit, but mainly I'm going to leave it to you to look up how you do that. That's like to get the better marks. You might not need to though. It's only if you like really need to. So again, think of your URL like a function call. Is that path on your URL is calling a specific method in your application. That's what it's doing. So we've got a view, we've got a controller. Let's add a model. So to add a model, I'm going to add a new item. Well, I'm going to add a class actually. It's going to be a normal C# class. And I'm going to be boring and call it contact. So then we've got our contact class. So I want to create now I'm going to give it 2 properties. Now, what's like some really, I'm going to try as much as possible. I use Visual Studio like a lot. And so if I do stuff really quickly, like just say, hey, how did you do that? Because there's like keyboard shortcuts that you get to learn. And this one like changed my life when I found it. So if you type in PROP, then double tap tab, it auto creates you a property. So we want to have a first name and last name. I'm going to say string. So I'm going to type the type string. If I push tab, it then goes to the name, and I can just say first name. And it's already put those default getters and setters there for us. Remember, I'm starting with a capital letter with my camel casing, because these are public properties. And they've got the getter and setter there. Now what we can do is we can actually pass, so let's go back to our controller. What we can actually do is we can pass a model to a view. So, but first we need to get the namespace. So using, what do we call our application? MVC from scratch.models. So that will pull in the scope of this folder, basically. And then let's just create a new one. So let's say contact. And I'm pushing tab to complete this. Contact. And it's given me Visual Studio. I really like Visual Studio. It's very good at... It does some very clever stuff to predict what you're going to do. It even does things like you might have lots of similar named variables. It can predict what variable you're going to set next. It does very clever stuff. I don't know how it does it. There's times where it's given me autocompletes. I just don't understand how it would have known that. So what this is that I'm creating, because I set those getters and setters, well, I didn't, Visual Studio did. Because those getters and setters are on there, I can create a new contact like this. I didn't have to make a constructor. Okay, I didn't have to write my own constructor because I've put these getters and setters in there. So what I can do is I can use this syntax where I say contact is a new contact, open up the curly braces and type in the different properties. And I could do that for as many public properties as I've got. And then I'm just going to pass it to this. Okay, so I'm actually going to send this contact to the view. But at the moment that won't do anything because I haven't told the view to display anything. So let's go to our view. Now you can also do, when this gets complicated, you can actually right click here and click go to view. And then it will load the view that would be called by that. So you're thinking, you need to think of everything as functions. Think of your view as a C# function. So, or a C# method. If I say function, by the way, it's because I was a physicist originally, and I learned Fortran as my first coding language. And so I talk in functions. Like I didn't do, object-oriented coding back then. So I always, that's a hard habit to break. So I apologize. So with a method, you have to tell a method what arguments to expect. So we need to tell our view what arguments to expect. And the way we do that is we say remember I'm telling it, I want to do some C#. So model with a lowercase m. And we're saying the model that this view expects is a MVC from scratch models.contact. Okay? I don't need to put the semicolon there because the scripting engine knows it's very clever actually. If you want to, a nice little exercise is to figure out, this automatically knows when you're switching from C# to HTML. It's quite clever. The question is, how many characters does it have to look in advance before it knows, oh, we're back to HTML now? That's if you want an interesting programming problem, try and figure that out. So now we've told it, we've said this view expects this model. So let's print the name. So I'm going to have a paragraph. Again, I'm just using, this is HTML. I'm just writing HTML here. My name is, and we're going to do, I want to do some C#. So I've got to tell it that this is C#. So I'm going to put the @ and then model with a capital M is the model that's been sent to this view. So I'm going to do model first name @ model last name. Let's save that and see how long this takes to run. And so what this is showing you, this is how simple it is, right? Is that we've told it what model we want, and we've just used that @ symbol, and we can type in the variable names, and these will get printed. What's even more clever about this system is that Visual Studio is automatically sanitizing that data. So it's sanitizing it. It's assuming that this is going into HTML. So it's going to look at that string, and if there are any tags, it's going to remove it. It's going to do all sorts of HTML encoding to make sure there's nothing nasty in there. So while that's loading, oh, there we go. Okay, so there, the name is there. Now, also, it's probably important to look at the developer tools. It's something maybe to get into the habit of is, so the favicon isn't there, that's what that error is. We want to, okay, if you go to settings, there's usually, I can't find it now, but somewhere, okay, here. There is a disable cache while DevTools is open. You want to have that checked when you're doing any debugging. If you don't, it'll cache the last thing it got. You make a change in your code and you'll see, oh, that hasn't made any difference. It's because it's just loading the cached version to save bandwidth. Right, so sources, we can see we've got the HTML here, and that's all that's been returned. So that's the basics, right? So if you can, that's like your foundation. Is we have a controller, we have a view, and we have a model, and we can pass models to our views. And that model doesn't have to be a single class like that. It could be a list. You could pass a list of objects, and then in your Razor, you could loop through that list and print everything line by line. Now, we don't have to return a view like this. We could also return not found. Okay, and what that would do is that would return a 404 error. And you might do that in a situation where this method could be going to a database to look for something. So you could be going to a URL that says, get me contact 5 in my list. And then it would go to the database, it would get contact 5 and return it the same way. But what if there isn't a contact there? Well, now you've got to check that, and if there isn't, you've got to do a not found. You've got to give some kind of error to the user or decide what happens. So you can return a not found. And there are similar, there are lots of methods like that for different errors. And you can also return like custom error messages, but I won't do that now. You can also return some content as well. So you could, in fact, you're probably not ever going to do this, but there is this content method. So you can just return a string. So you can just return a string to the browser like that using the content method. But all of these things return something that implement this iAction result. But it gives us a way to do that. Now, the next thing is, so that's a normal path. So we've just gone to a path. Now we want to try and actually send some data. So send some get parameters. So let's go back to our contact class. I'm going to add another property. So prop, double tap tab. It's an int and it's going to be ID. And then in our controller, remember, much like I turned this into like a function or a method that takes an input, I'm going to change our controller class to something that takes an input. So I'm going to say int ID. And then I'm going to say ID equals ID, comma. That works because I've set the default getters and setters. Then on my index, I'm going to say, and my ID is, oh, no, I need to model with a capital M, ID. Save that. I'm going to run it. And then what that does is because we've said the controller now has an input, which is an integer, we can give it an integer in the URL. So I'm just going to wait for this to load. It should start to get quicker as we do this more. I don't know why. It just seems to. Right, okay, so the ID is currently 0. But then if I type ID equals 2, then that changes to 2. Okay, because I've put in that get parameter. So I've put that get parameter in. The request has gone in with that information. In my controller, I told it to expect an integer called ID. And I've put that ID in there, and it's used it to add the ID to that contact. It's returned the contact. The contact has that ID in it, so it's printed it there. Now I can also do this. So I can type home, index, ID equals 3. That works. And also there's something else that works, which is this. Now what I've done here is I've added an extra directory to this with a number in it. This is a part of the default routing system. So the default routing system allows you to put an integer at the end of your path, and it takes that in and assigns it to the ID. It's just a convention, it's a default. The reason they do this is, again, imagine a web application where I want to get contact number 3. Well, wouldn't it make sense if my URL was mycontacts.com/contacts/3, and that gets me contact number 3. And then I, as a user, can say, well, if I want contact number 4, I just need to change this number, right? And then you get contact number, whatever. And so that's part of the default routing, and you can change that to whatever you want. So if you don't want it to be called ID, you could change it, or if you want some crazy URL that's looks like this, and for some reason that makes sense for your application, you can do that. What's quite nice is that we don't have to have a simple integer here. I could actually take a contact. Yeah, I could actually just take a full contact in there, and it would still work. Now, what's quite clever is that this all works because of something called model binding. Now, what the model binder does is it looks at everything that's being sent in from the HTML, so the HTTP. So as the user, you send this thing, and it might have 5 or 6 parameters. It might have ID equals 2, ampersand, first name equals me, ampersand, whatever, okay? So we could add all those different parameters to the URL. The model binder looks at all the data that was sent to the server. It looks at the model, at what this controller is expecting, and it matches those things up. So it will look and it says, right, okay, the contact class has a first name in it. Did the user send anything that's called first name with its request? And if it does, it says, oh, they match, and it puts them together. And that's really good, but there are some security issues with that, which we'll talk about another day. Now, if I could make it so the index takes in a contact method, and you type, and it's all in the get parameters, but that would be kind of rubbish because you'd end up having a massive URL for a complex class. So in reality, what we'd want to do is do it through a get request. So remember we talked about how we could do, a post request, not get. So this is using get, and a post would be the form data is put into the header lines of the request. They're not in the URL. So remember, a GET request is like the YouTube thing. It's you want to get something, so you're saying I want to get video, whatever the ID is, or I want to get contact number 6. Whereas a PUT request is I want to add a new video or add a new contact, and that's going to have a lot more information. So we want to upload those using the headers, not in the URL. So we're going to change things a little bit here. So what our goal is, we want to have a form on our index page that we type things out, and then when we push enter, we want to see the index with all the data we added to that form. So immediately, hopefully you see that we're going to need 2 different types of index. One with the form, and one that's got the data on it as well. So to do that, we actually can use overloading. So we can actually have 2 index methods. So I'm going to create a new index method here. HTTP get. I'll tell you what this is in a second. So public action result index. And then it's going to just return the view. So what this is saying, so here, remember when we're overloading methods, we can have methods that have the same name, but they have to either return something different or take in different arguments. And part of us saying to the compiler that this is a different method is that we're going to give it this data annotation. This is an annotation. That's what this thing means with the square brackets. HTTP get. So we're saying this action, the index action, is what you should call if the request is a GET request. But if it's a POST request, I want you to call this version of the action. And this version of the action, I'm going to comment this out. And this is going to take in a contact. And then just return that to the view. Now we already have set our view up to accept a contact. Now what we need to do is we need to make a different type of view that has got the form in it. Okay, so I'm going to create a new view. So I'm going to do in our home, add view. And I'm going to call this one index with form. And it's going to be empty. I'm not using the scaffolding just yet, even though it says scaffolding. So we're going to have 2 different index views. We're going to have one for when the user is coming for the first time and there's no data. And there's going to be a different index view for when they've sent the data up, which is going to show them the data they just sent. So what we're going to do is I'm going to add a form. So I'm going to say form action. So action, remember, is like the path that this form is going to send its data to. Home index. And then the method is going to be post, because we're going to do it with the post data. And I've got the form there. I want to input type is text. So a text field, name equals ID, value equals nothing, and then I'm closing, good practice, I'm closing this element. So I'm going to copy this twice, and then here I'm going to have first name. So I'm matching these names to my class, and then I want a button to submit it. So I'm going to do button type submit value equals submit, and call it submit. Okay, so this is going to be a form that does this. And we only have to do one more thing, which is we go back to our controller. Now, this function here, I can actually give it the name of the view I want it to return. It doesn't have to return the one that the convention wants it to. I can just do index with form. And what it will do, it will return that specific view. Okay, so I'm telling it return the index with form if it's a GET request. So let's see if this works. But there you could put any index that you could put any view that you want. I know this is kind of irritating, but I need to show you. This will be more irritating when you're debugging yourself, believe me. I have checked. I got as far as installing Visual Studio on one of the computers, then I need to leave, but I'm going to check everything's working in the labs. So I've got my form here. Like, I've done this lazily. I haven't put any names, but like I know this was ID, this was first, and this is last. So what's happened is I made a HTTP request, a GET request. This is the first time I went there. And that meant that it saw the routing system, looked at the path and said, right, it's home controller index. It said, oh, there's two index methods. Which one do I pick? Well, it's HTTP, it's a GET request, so it's got to be this one. And then this view has not returned the default index view. It's returned the one with the form. Now I'm clicking submit. When I clicked submit, it made a post request because in my form, I said method post, and I gave it the action. It sent that post data. Then the routing system is, oh, they still want the index method of the home controller, but it's post. So I'm going to do this one. It then sees that it's expecting a contact object, a contact model. Well, because in my form, I named all these values the same as in my contact model, the model binder then just was like, ID, last name, first name, done. And that's how that's all worked. So now we've got a situation where I'm sending a model to my view. The view is sending that to a controller. The controller is saying, okay, now I want the model, and it's all passing around. Yeah.
Would the model binder have worked if things were in a different order?
So no. Oh, what do you mean? Do you mean the form?
Like if it had said last name then first name for the form.
Yes, if the form, it doesn't matter what order the form is in, it would have worked. It's like it wouldn't have worked, and this is coming on to my next thing. Like, well, if I do Sean and then 2, okay, what it's doing here is my name is 2 Walton and my ID is 0. And the reason that's happening is because we haven't put any data validation there. So we're not actually checking to see if those numbers are if those things are correct. Now, in this case, the only error we've seen is that the ID has gone to 0 because a string can't be converted to an integer. But if we were adding that to a database, we would really care that that data was wrong. So we could like manually. What we could do is in our home controller, we could like manually check it here. And we could say, oh, is that a string? Is this an integer, etc. But there is something that we can use in MVC that helps us. So we can go to our contact and we can add some data annotations. So what we can do is we can say ID is, and I will need to install the classes. So because I need to install some more packages, and we all know how that goes, take a 10-minute break, and then we'll continue on with this lecture. So back here at 5.2.